having me on the program. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be speaking this morning. I think I have learned a lot from the last two talks, and I think I'm very happy to be placed just after them. I think the first talk very nicely introduced what I'm going to draw upon as the mathematical persona, and I think the second talk very neatly drew on, let's say, associations between instances that I can also relate to in my paper. It's part of joint work with our Sørensen, who's a historian of literature, and it's on narrating Abel aesthetics as biography of the mathematical persona. And I'm going to read part of it. I'm sorry, but I'll also have something to say at large in a second. So I think, as this workshop has already shown and will show, the relations and bridges between mathematics and culture can of course be approached, studied, and even crossed in a number of different ways. As historians of literature and mathematics, respectively, Kragh and I are interested in understanding the ways in which mathematics and culture have engaged with each other. And our approach is to investigate instances where mathematics has emerged in broader culture, either when mathematics and mathematicians are explicitly taken up on the content level, when values about mathematics are addressed in cultural products, or when mathematics is tacitly drawn upon for the interpretation and use of a cultural product to achieve its full potential. Instances of these various types of interrelations have already figured, I think, especially in the first talk, and in what I have to say, I'm going to address one that has not yet been so prominent, perhaps, the cultural conception and appropriation of the mathematical persona from the biographical genre. And the pivotal figure of my talk is this Norwegian mathematician, Henrik Abel, who is, I think, rightfully famous among mathematicians and Norwegians alike. Yet you will only indirectly learn about the life that he lived and the mathematics that he produced. So a short introduction might be called for that will bring out the key features required for the subsequent analysis. So born in 1802 and dead less than 27 years later, his short life spans important events in Norwegian history. When Abel was born, Norway was in a union with Denmark. When he died, another union with Sweden has supplanted the old one after a brief spell of Norwegian independence. Never awarded a permanent position and constantly short of money and emotional and financial security, Abel embodies many of the romantic myths and ideals of the young, neglected genius, too far ahead of his time to win recognition in his own lifetime. Feeding into the emerging nationalistic sentiments in Norway during the second half of the 19th century, the Abelian legacy quickly earned a swing over Norwegian culture and the fascination of mathematicians worldwide, not least through the biographical genre. Although official recognition and reward did not come to Abel before his early death, mathematicians all over Europe were thinking very highly of his contributions. Even within his own lifetime, influential voices praised this lasting monument to mathematics, as Legendre put it, and during the 19th century, his fame grew along with the mathematical importance of the topics that he had studied. Just 3 examples would suffice today. Abel was involved in some of the dramatic discoveries that showed that the received mathematics, both geometry and analysis, were not on a sufficiently secure footing. So that would be my example up here. In effect, during his grand European tour, Abel became one of the most ardent followers of Cauchy's new approach to analysis as based on limits, and that's the exception that he points out in the footnote, that this is an exception to a theorem by Cauchy that any convergent series of continuous functions is also a continuous function. This one is a counterexample, or as he said, an exception. But even before that, Abel had made his name among those in the know. When Abel had just finished his years at the Cathedral School in Oslo, he came into contact with a professor of mathematics in Copenhagen called C.F. Dean, who kindly directed Abel toward the study of so-called elliptic transcendentals. So things like that one over there. And in that subject, Dean suspected one could discover a veritable strait of Magellan Street leading into entirely new forays of analysis. Soon Abel would take up this suggestion, and his most important contributions fell in providing the theory of elliptic and higher transcendentals with a new foundation during a fierce mathematical race or combat with Jacobi. In this field, and in others, such as his research on algebraic solvability of equations, Abel was noticed for, quote, taking the most elevated point of view, unquote, in terms of what Weierstrass thought very highly of Abel. And he did that by asking fundamentally new kinds of questions. Through such changes of perspective, Abel was seen to herald in the new, modern and conceptual approach to mathematics that would culminate in the late 19th century. And these topics of conquest and contemplation of national hero and tragic genius will resonate through the cases that we are about to discuss. So in the following, what I'm going to do is to investigate a number of aesthetic representations of Abel and his mathematics that span art and fiction. The major occasion for such aesthetic representations was the centennial celebrations in 1902, when the romantic ideal of Abel was invoked to showcase Norwegian cultural identity. Building on our, that's Laura's and mine, interdisciplinary readings and analysis of poems and sculptures, we discuss how the mathematical persona and Abel's mathematical ideas and achievements were interpreted and mitigated. And for this occasion we have singled out 3 key works, and I'll introduce them at length later, but they are Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's celebratory poem of 1902, Gustav Vigeland's Abel statue from 1908, and Jan Kjærstad's much more recent Jonas Wergeland trilogy that you may know of. So let's talk a bit about the link between this and what I am interested in. I'm interested in writing a meta-biography of Abel in the sense that Kragh had done for Humboldt, in order not just to study the appropriations of Abel, but also to say something about Abel's legacy in Norwegian mathematics. Just to give you one example, when the Norwegian mathematician, let's call him that, Ole Jacob Brock, was sent on his European tour in the 1840s, he was given a letter of introduction to the Paris mathematicians, where his professors back in Norway said, in writing, we hope that this guy will be the next Abel. So that's the legacy part. That is the weight, the currency that the Abelian legacy was supposed to carry in Europe. I want to understand how that came to be, how that influenced mathematics in Norway. So Niels Henrik Abel is an important figure in the history of mathematics and in Norwegian national culture. I hope I have just outlined that. Moreover, his life incorporated critical national events and exhibits expressive features of the romantic tragic genius. Therefore, Abel's life has been subjected to numerous biographical treatments and, as we shall focus on here, to a number of other aesthetic and artistic representations. If you want, you can think of it like this. You can think of the life of the protagonist, in my case Abel. You can think of representations of that life, and you can then think of what I want to do is look back not to the life of Abel, but to these representations to figure out how they came about and how they represent and appropriate the original life. So Abel's life lived, if you want, here represented by the only extant depiction of him. His life lived has become a life told on numerous occasions. From the first obituaries, where his friends would commemorate him, and they would make an argument against the mistreatment, his mistreatment at the hands of the Norwegian state, to later biographies where especially Carl Anton Bjerknes would argue at length about the chronology of key events in the race with Jacobi so as to establish Abel's priority, to later biographies where his mathematics was treated in more historical context, and to the most recent one, which is Stubhaug's biography, where Abel is seen as part of a much broader cultural context of describing Norway in this formative period during the early 19th century. So his life lived has become a life told on numerous occasions, and one of them is this 1902 incident that I'll return to later. It has also become a life depicted, not least in sculpture and image, and some of these depictions hold great national iconic status, such as coins or notes or stamps. And it has even become a life, I would say, metaphorized, so used metaphorically, when authors and others can draw upon it for setting a frame for shared cultural knowledge or imagination. And just as every new biography is a transposition of a selection of the known factual information into the genre of biography, each of these other artistic representations also represents some kind of triangulation that transposes the biographical information into new genres. So you have the life lived, and you want to appropriate it into the context where you want to give a representation of it, but also into the genre that defines the medium for which you're going to do that. And in the case of ordinary biographies, these transpositions are relatively obvious. Changes in the available source material and in the literary and cultural expectations and genres shape the biography at different times. The life lived is, so to speak, appropriated into the life told. And this simple insight is at the basis of this meta-biographical project that I briefly described, which uses biographical representations of Abel against the development of the biographical genre to write a new history of Norwegian mathematics. Yet when other media and genres are considered, the analytical setup complicates a bit. And for the present purpose, it's no longer sufficient to trace the biographical genre. Instead, what I want to do is to use traditions and intertextual references within each new media and genre to be included in the analysis. And in this paper, we can only highlight this claim by drawing on two nexuses of artistic representations: sculptures that fashion the identity of a genius, and literary portrayals that use it to shape a new national identity. A few words about the genres and why you can see that there may be something to do about that. Sculptures are synoptic in the sense that an entire life lived need to be wrapped into a single instance that can be read and decoded. Thus, the narratives are synoptic in nature. By contrast, the literary depictions can use a temporarily extended narrative to capture the life lived. Their complexity arises from the fact that the need to cram an entire national identity or a comprehensive cultural context or an entire Weltanschauung into the representation. And this observation of the different genres is of course not new. It goes at least back to Lessing, but it provides the starting point for our two readings that we are going to present. So sculptures first. Fashioning an identity as the tragic genius. In connection with the centennial celebrations around 1902, Abel's 100th anniversary of Abel's birth, prospects were solicited for a bust of Abel to be cast and placed in a prominent public space in Oslo. 3 different suggestions were made, and among them Ingebrigt Wiig's bust was chosen, so that's the winner in the middle, right? However, controversy set in, and instead Gustav Vigeland's large sculpture, that's this one over here, was commissioned for a corner of the Royal Gardens, now called Abelhaugen, in the middle of Oslo. Whereas Wiig's winning bronze bust is a classic, rather dull representation, carefully crafted to resemble the only contemporary evidence of Abel's physical appearance, the other 2 entries in the composition, Vigeland's large stele and the bust by Gustav Lerum, exhibit much clearer intentions of interpreting and representing Abel's genius in the artistic form. And the really interesting analysis derived from comparing the 2 works, but let me commence by considering them individually. So Lerum's bust appears to be a traditional rendering or rendition of the protagonist seated. The style of clothing and his hair clearly position the bust in a broad tradition with numerous contemporary counterparts in the portrayals of the romantic persona, among them, of course, Wiig's winning bust. However, beyond the first glance, Lerum's Abel is much more than Wiig's stylistically and emotionally shallow young man. Wiig's Abel was austere and bürgerlich, but Lerum's Abel is actually in anguish. Our attention is drawn both to his left hand that supports his bent head and to his right hand that lingers over his retracted leg. This is a deeply introvert character depicted, a thinking genius withdrawn from the world. As such, the sculpture echoes the tradition of the melancholic thinker established by Dürer, for instance by Dürer's Melancholia from 1514. Withdrawn and introvert, the melancholic genius things above and beyond the capabilities of ordinary people. And in Abel's right hand, Leum has placed a piece of paper reclined towards the ground and out of the main focus of the sculpture. Even that piece of paper cannot encompass all of Abel's genius and thoughts. We're thus faced with a portrayal of what happens to the otherworldly genius when it's confronted with the mundane conditions of insecurity and incommensurability. Such themes resonate with other biographical depictions of Abel in the 19th century, in particular the accounts by those who knew him, and it can be backed by extracts from Abel's correspondence that had actually also been published by 1902. Vigeland's Abel is, as would be expected from such a modernist turn-of-the-century sculpture, something quite different. Vigeland's Abel is not the quiet genius. It is a much louder, larger one, taking command of the situation and gazing into the unknown. It's the powerful, muscular, aggressive, and Promethean embodiment of genius whose abilities lie not in silent contemplation but in action and conquest. Vigeland's Abel is a man of nature, more specifically Norwegian nature, and his pose and his sternness in the face of adversity draws on parallels to classic works such as Laocoon. Lessing, in writing on the Laocoon, sought to define the difference between the visual arts and literature. And literature, according to Lessing, is absorbed in time and manifested by what he calls conventional signs, which are words, which on their own carry no meaning. In the visual arts, the dimension of time cannot be found. Instead, they utilize extensions such that a closer relationship emerges between the object or theme being represented and the representation itself. An example will perhaps be illuminating. Whereas literature can describe horrible things without using horrible words, in the Laocoon you can only show the horror by actually showing it. So in the composition, Vigeland's Abel stands, or perhaps even better, he sails on the fragmented and blurred parts of other people, the manifestation of the subdued geniuses over whom Abel towers. Thus Vigeland's dramatic Abel echoes a classic scientific homage, namely to Newton's overly modest statement in a letter to Robert Hooke, that if he had seen further, it was because he had stood on the shoulders of giants. And here Abel is not standing on the shoulders of giants exactly, right? Yet Vigeland's Abel not only stands on giants, is in motion across a sea littered with human remnants. This Abel, therefore, is not the classic theory builder, but more akin to the Victorian adventurer, also so fashioned in Norwegian culture around the turn of the century. Vigeland's Abel has his hair swept by the wind, while simultaneously at a steady footing over an uneven surface. Abel can conquer the Magellan Street and reach an elevated viewpoint from where to gaze forward into unknown riches. There's even a string of aggressively godlike connotations to this Abel who rises above the sea to point in the direction forward. Thus, in these two sculptures, we are faced with two distinct yet established perspectives on the persona of the genius. One of them points backwards to the romantic genius, while the other one perhaps points forwards to the more modernistic one. I'll come back to them in a second. Both are backed by past and contemporary genre-specific conventions and biographical and contextual norms. Yet they exhibit almost contradictory images of the life lived. Leum's Abel is a silent, immobile, introvert, melancholic thinker, whereas Vigeland's Abel is a dynamic conqueror, extrovert and action-oriented. In each of the different ways, they both perhaps share in that iconic image of romantic genius, which is Friedrich's Wandererlied in Nebelmeer, which almost becomes, I would perhaps suggest, a mean proportional between them. It connects to the distinction between the sublime and the beautiful that links back to the Romantic era when it was heavily discussed also by philosophers. The sublime was connected with the awe, pain, infinity, unsurveyability and insurmountability, and on the other hand, beauty was confined, surveyable, pleasing and calm. In a sense, Vigeland and Vig epitomize these two views. Vigeland's Abel stands at the edge and looks down, and perhaps Leum is also here a mean proportional. It shows genius as a mediator between the earthly and the absolute. Thus, I would say these artistic representations are not only appropriations of Abel in the sense found in ordinary biographies, but also transpositions into the media and genre at hand. And most interestingly, these genre specifics are actually also contemporary to the person being portrayed, in this case, Abel. For the second nexus of analysis, I turn to literature, and especially to shaping an identity for the nation. The second nexus of analysis centers on the tragic, or rather the tragic hero as a national icon, reading artistic representations of Abel into the genre of the tragic hero. Here, topics such as the hero's privileged access to interpret the world of mathematics in ways that transcend ordinary beings. The hero takes upon himself the destiny or his identity and sacrifices himself for his creativity, again in our case mathematics. For the centennial of Abel's birth, leading Norwegian intellectuals mobilized to showcase Norwegian culture in a bid to harness nationalistic sentiments. In the words of the explorer Fridtjof Nansen, quote, "We will not have an opportunity like this for the next 100 years." End of quote. International guests were invited among the world's leading mathematicians, and they were treated to a special event in the National Theatre. For that occasion, and with the purpose of printing it in the ambitious Festschrift in both Norwegian and French versions, a celebratory poem was commissioned from the national troubadour, the aging Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson. It was performed accompanied by music by Sinding after the international guests had witnessed a special performance of Henrik Ibsen's Per Gynt, so you can see all that is good and Norwegian in one place. So if Vigeland's sculpture invoked the Newtonian theme, Bjørnson's poem was outright in drawing upon Pope's famous epitaph for Newton, where Pope had famously recast Genesis as "Let Newton be and there was light." Bjørnson, in the often quoted opening stanza, relates the dawn of day, the birth of Abel, and the budding of the Norwegian nation as follows. And this is the Norwegian original of the official French translation, my very rough and not so nice English translation. So I'll read the Norwegian. En ånd er os nær, under stjernetegnet for Norges opgang, den tændtes her. You can follow the English one if you want to. And later, this dawn of man and of nation is explicitly linked to the intellectual achievement. En ånd er os nær, dens lysende her, i tankesus fylder vort hus. Abel's extraordinary creative mathematical genius is thus given explicitly religious undertones as both the reader and interpreter and the creator of the great book of nature. For instance, Bjørnson links Abel directly to the nativity in the following stanza, which also reflect the occasion for which the poem was commissioned. Hans fødselsstjerne lyser frem til vuggen, vise mænd fra de fjerne 100 år er her som i går. And in the much quoted and very important, very last stanza, Bjørnson addressed the claim for Norwegian national and cultural relevance. In Vestland skudt var han på Vellingsnes år, nu verden ham ejer, men guden var vor. And thus, so this, he belongs to the world, but yeah, boy, he belongs to us. Thus, the notions of genius, national pride, cultural relevance, and the universal nature of mathematics were packed into a potent and resonating poetic form. In Bjørnson's hands, Abel has become an interpreter of nature whose genius grasp was set down in science that it took a century to decode. They, both the science and Abel's legacy in creating them, have then become the foundation upon which not only science of the cosmos, but also the Norwegian nation is to be built. Bjørnson's poem did not even stand alone at the celebrations. An even more national romantic epilogue, written by the mathematician and poet Elling Holst, was also read in front of the guests. And here I'll try to read some of the English translation. I didn't bring the quote, I'm sorry. His mother, the poor bleeding Norway, hardly owned her daily dry bread. For herself and hers she gathered what she needed against famine and misery. So you can see the national crisis and the contemporary context of the Abelian, both during his lifetime and during the appropriation he played upon. So tacitly drawing upon Abel's own maternal neglect, the individual and the national identity are here fused into one that can now be invoked in an effort to bolster Norwegian cultural legitimacy in its bid for independence. As is well known, at least in Scandinavia, Norway gained its independence from Sweden soon thereafter, in 1905. Yet the Abelian legacy has proved the lasting element of the national identity. In 2002, as you all know, the bicentennial of Abel's birth, the Umbridge nation set up a foundation to award an annual prize for mathematical research comparable to the Nobel Prizes. And in literature and popular culture, the legacy also persisted. Stubhaug, in his biography published in 1996 on Abel, published his great biography in 1996, and Abel played an important role in the so-called Jonas Wergeland trilogy. You may have known the English titles are The Seducer, The Conqueror, and The Discoverer, by the acclaimed Norwegian author Jan Kjærstad. Kjærstad's protagonist, the fictional TV producer Jonas Wergeland, sets out to narrate a story for the sake of Norway. And this is the very beginning. Let me tell you another story. Although I do not know whether that is possible, not after all that has been written and said, but at any rate, let me try. I barked at it long enough, I admit. I put it off and put it off, but I had to do it, knowing full well that this would sound unutterably provocative and appallingly high flow. I'll be straight about it. I do it not only for myself, but for the whole of Norway. So the ambition of both the fictitious TV show that he's going to run on so-called heroic Norwegians and of Kjærstad's own trilogy is thinking big. And the ambition is applied to the entire Norwegian nation, past and present. And in this respect, Abel is invoked as a pivotal figure in what is described, quote, as the most subjective and aggressive of Jonas Wergeland's programs. So that's also true. Wergeland is confronting head-on the Norwegian, quote-unquote, national inferiority complex, which is described in the novel set as described in the novel set as a custom search of Wergeland, but translated into his feeling as a nigger in Paris, quote-unquote, and nothing that was humiliated by the French just because they could do so. And in the fictitious TV program, Abel is then played by, again, a famous but fictional Norwegian actor who, quote-unquote, is made up to look like a Negro. Abel's encounters with the Institute in Paris was recast as a tale of intellectual racism, of the degradation of a small nation, of the world's doubts that anything good could really come out of Norway. And in the final detailed description of the TV episode in the novel, Wergeland had focused on Abel's disappointment at the hands of the Paris Academy. From this, Jonas, so that's the TV producer, cut to a close-up of the front page of his manuscript, Abel's manuscript, showing what was for him, Jonas, the obvious cue to Abel's failure. After his name, Abel had added from Norway. Could these grand gentlemen have been in any doubt? This addition was their guarantee that they were looking at a manuscript they did not have to take seriously, which they could, therefore, treat with the greatest indifference. So whenever Abel's name is then, following this invoked in the novel over the next pages in describing the program, it's immediately connoted to Norway, Abel the Norwegian, Abel from Norway, and so on. And through the description of the dramatic effects of the TV program, fictitious TV program, Abel's misery, poverty, cold and eventual fatal disease were blamed on the ignorant, quote-unquote, pompous French who failed to recognize the genius from the far north. Quote, so here walked, here sat, a genius, an unacknowledged genius, a supposed nothing who was, in fact, a number one, unquote. And, indeed, France had killed a Norwegian, one of the greatest Norwegians of all time. So Kjærstad's novel does something that few of the other works treated here have been able to do. It actually devotes some attention to describing Abel's actual mathematics, and it gets it right, unlike Bjørnson's highly stylized and stereotypical rendering of Abel's contributions. Kjærstad instead relates how Wergeland had considered this or that aspect of Abel's genius mathematical results to include, but Wergeland had rather opted for the tale of killing a Norwegian. Instead, in a beautiful description of the imagined dramatic effect, Wergeland had projected actual fragments of Abel's mathematical formulae onto Parisian buildings for the whole final minute of the program. It was described, quote, almost like graffiti, a rebellion, vandalism, and algebraic conquest, end of quote. Thus, the themes of the neglected genius and the conquering genius finally combine in an act of revenge, an instance that Norway and mathematics has, through thinking big, redeemed itself and shown its worth to even the pompous French. The chapter on Abel in the Conqueror is entitled Cain and Abel, yet this religious reference does not appear explicitly in the chapter. It does, however, resonate throughout on the analytical way. Abel is throughout portrayed as a victim, an anti-hero, and an object in the machinations of others. Thus, just as Abel is akin to Lerum's sculpture, an introvert genius who suffers at his inability to engage with the world and command it. As such, the two different analytical nexuses line up. There is a connection between Kjerstad and Lerum, and similar, one could argue that Bjørnson's creator and Vigeland's adventurer each, at least by contrast, embody a vision of the genius as a commander of nature, who also through references to Nansen and other Norwegian explorers embody the national sentiment and point toward the independent cultural place for Norway. So in this talk, I hope to have shown that, first, the biographical appropriation of a mathematician is an interesting instance of the bridge building between mathematical and broader popular cultures. Indeed, much more can be said on this issue from the meta-biographical viewpoint, if that's the context that we're taking. Second, that the appropriation into non-biographical cultural forms, what I have here called artistic representations, opens up for and requires an additional level of analysis, namely what I have loosely referred to as intertextual or intermediate readings of references, echoes, contrasts, and similarities. In this way, we claim aesthetic meaning can be analyzed by treating these works as biographical representations. Third, in the concrete cases drawn upon here, new nexuses of analysis emerge which are in resonance with findings from the meta-biographical project itself. Namely, first, the construction and representation of the mathematical genius as a type of the romantic genius, and second, the appropriation of the hero for the construction of grand nationalistic narratives and identities. That's the tragic hero story that I mentioned. Fourth, yet, although known from the meta-biographical project, these two issues took a different and more dramatic form in the artistic representations. Sometimes they were even in conflict, as was discussed concerning the interpretation of genius, where the two works discussed put different emphasis on the biographical record. Fifth, thereby they also offer different images of the more general mathematical persona for broader cultural reference. Norwegian authors, later authors such as Erik Honoré, can, and explicitly after 1902, do refer to Abel in its biographical and artistic form to draw upon connotations and shared imagination for use in their own narrative, so to speak. Abel has become a metaphor that can be called upon in other relations. Yet this is not specific to Abel or to Norway, of course. It's a general form of mitigating mathematics for the broader culture. And finally, I hope to have shown, or at least suggested, how the history of mathematics, of literature, and of visual culture have each been addressed, drawn upon, and advanced through this integrative approach. Thank you very much.